Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Stephanie Jemison. I'm an artist and a co-convener of the writing community at Lewis Place, along with Quincy Flowers, Naima Lowe, Genevieve Janakiraman, the community liaison for this project this weekend, and Jessica Harvey, another amazing community liaison who's assisting us today, alongside an extraordinary team of writers and artists of all kinds who have come together in horizontal community to learn from and with one another as thinkers and makers. We are thrilled and grateful to welcome you to the first Artist Publishing Practicum, a crash course in book publishing for artists of all kinds. We'd like to extend special thanks to the Wagner Foundation for their support of this project. Before I continue, I want to highlight that you can access live open captions, carefully captioned by our captioner, Jason. Thank you very much, Jason. From the bar at the bottom of your screen, if you click the triangle to the right of show captions, you'll also see the option to view the transcript. Because the captions are live, you will experience a slight delay of 1 or 2 seconds. So thank you so much for your patience. All artist publishing practicum sessions today will be recorded, and the recordings will be made available as part of a resource archive. If you haven't already signed up for our mailing list, we encourage you to do that, and you'll be notified when the archive is live. So I want to begin by quickly reviewing our schedule today. After this housekeeping information, we'll begin with our first session featuring Kameelah Janan Rasheed, who will share her journey with writing, publishing, and print. Next, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Rachel Valinsky and I will offer Artist Publishing 101, a comprehensive introduction to publishing journeys and vocabularies, which will introduce the key considerations and scenarios we'll return to throughout the weekend. We'll take a short bio break from 3 Eastern to 3:30 Eastern. And at 3:30 Eastern, Karen Kelly of Dancing Foxes Press will speak about art book publishing. At 4:30 Eastern, literary agent and editor Erica Stevens will introduce literary publishing and will finish today at 5:30 Eastern. All sessions today and tomorrow include a 10 or 15-minute Q&A, depending on the preference of the speaker. Questions will be collected throughout each session via the chat in your Zoom window only by our amazing liaisons, Jessica and Genevieve. Naima Lowe, our community coordinator, will present the questions to the speakers, and we ask that you please remain muted unless we specifically invite you otherwise. When speakers have handouts or notes, these will also be shared via the Zoom chat, and you should absolutely feel free to use the chat to connect with one another, pose questions, and respond to all of our amazing guests today. If you have questions specifically for the organizing team, you can send them directly to any of the Lewis Place staffers that have, you'll see some people have like a purple pink background that says share your questions via the chat. So you can share it with any of those folks. We've also tried to add at Lewis Place to our name so that you can easily see so you can feel free to send us a direct message. You can also, we are monitoring email today, and you can feel free to send an email to publishing@lewisplace.com. We invite you to share the space with us in a spirit of trust and a spirit of care. And we thank you so much for bringing grace, respect, and generosity to our incredible guests today. I would love to invite everyone to quickly share in the chat if you'd like your name and where you're writing from today, just so that we can begin to get to know each other. If you want to share an introduction, and we can return to these throughout the day. Without further ado, I am very excited to introduce Kameelah Janan Rasheed. Kameelah and I met over 10 years ago. Kameelah, can you believe this? I went deep into our email archive. We have a long email history. And we actually met on a panel convened by the incredible artist Mariam Ghani and Trisha Ganesh at New York University about radical archiving in artistic practice. And when I was preparing this introduction, I went through all of my emails with Kameelah. Kameelah has sent me some beautifully kind, generous emails over the years, which are so sweet and such a reminder of the way that Kameelah has always been a relationship builder who values mentorship and values connection and values horizontal learning and changes every space that she enters. I've been so thrilled to learn and grow alongside Kameelah. I consider her a comrade and fellow traveler for the last many years. I will say that we're especially grateful Kameelah could join us today because Kameelah is one of the very busiest artists I know, like one of the busiest people in my life, in my world. Some of you have heard me complain about being busy. Listen, I have nothing on Kameelah. Kameelah is so incredibly committed to community. That's how I understand. That's the way that I think about the fullness of your life is that it reflects the generosity of your spirit. There's so much that you take on that you don't need to do. All of us are so grateful for the many opportunities you offer for us to learn with you. And we're so grateful that you're also able to take time to join us here today. As a writer, and as an interviewer, Kameelah has published essays and interviews in Triple Canopy, The New Inquiry, The Believer, and Gawker. Kameelah is the author of 5 books. In the Coherence We Weep, published by Cave Institute for Contemporary Art last year. I am published by Moose. An alphabetical accumulation of approximate observations, published by Endless Editions in 2019. No New Theories, published by Printed Matter in 2019 as well. And the digital publication Scoring the Stacks, which was published with the Brooklyn Public Library in 2021. Before her adult publishing, Kameelah authored half a dozen books as a 6 and 7-year-old. Her relationship to publishing and print goes so deep. You can learn more about Kameelah on her website, kameelahr.com. She also publishes an amazing newsletter and kind of resource and research guide that I encourage you to subscribe to that you can also find on her website. Thank you so much, Kameelah, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I feel like, yes, I'm very busy, but I'm very, very excited about this. This is something I was looking forward to as I was traveling this week. And I also just want to say Stephanie was one of the first artists that I emailed and contacted when I came to New York, who actually replied and was like nice and helpful and kind. I remember being like, how do I do this? And you get your life together, get this organized, remember that so clearly. So I do to say very much thank you for my practice and always looping me to these activities. Um, it's highly likely we're not going to get through everything. That is just going to be okay. I have a timer next to me because I don't believe in time. That's not my relationship. But we have a great team of folks here who will make sure that things happen as they should. I'm going to go ahead and just begin this image of me. I am in Miss Morsoli's class. I am raising my hand to answer a question that no one has asked. And I'm aware that no one has asked a question because I was very bored in school. And so I would just sort of think of my own curriculum in my head and then answer a question that I thought my should have asked as a way to prompt her figure out that I needed more challenge. And so as sort of support me and not getting beat or bothered by other students, there are a couple of adults in my life after school who sort of like pulled me into some programming that allowed for me to sort of figure out who I was and to find a place to sort of sprawl and to develop the things that I needed to develop. And one of those places was the Publishing Center. The Publishing Center was literally a trailer that was in the like playground area, and there's just like this older woman whose name I cannot remember. She had a typewriter, she had a binding materials, and you could go in there with handwritten stories and type them for you, or you could write, but you everything. And I would just spend every single lunch period in there making books. And I think there was a very clear moment for me where it was like, I like reading books. I love going to the library, but something about the idea of making a and sharing a book and having people listen to me read a book felt distinctly different from the idea of just reading a book. And one of those really beautiful experiences was that people come and listen to us like 7 and 8-year-olds read our ridiculous books. And we were asked to write about the authors, which I took very seriously. The first about the author I wrote says, I'm 6 years old. My mom is a nice lady. I'm nice like mom. I have 6 people in my house. I have more people. I have 15 people. My grandpa died. My name is Kameelah, all over the place. But by the time I'm 7 years old, I start to have a last name and some clarity about what I'm doing in the world. My name is Kameelah Rasheed. I'm 7 years old and go to flood school. 7 years old is very young, but I like to read, write, and do art. I live in East Palo Alto. I'm in the second grade. I'm a good reader. And so I want to start here because so much of the way that I think about publishing and the way that I think of life in general is through the context of being a learner. And for a long time, that was very hard for me to come to terms with. You fill out a grant application. Okay, so you're installation text-based. And I was like, yeah, all of those things, but at the core of it, I'm just sort of a person here visiting Earth, trying to learn and to connect with as many ideas as I can. And so I'm just excited again to be a learning with all you guys today. So let's get moving. I love making agendas, especially we have no intentions of sticking to them. So this is the plan. This is the score for today. Our performance may be very different. We're going to spend a little bit of time in grounding very quickly, some dedicated devotion, some notes on form, get into some genealogy of my practice, thinking about publishing in relation to compression and quantum entanglement, thinking about what publishing is or could be, at a sort of case study of one book that I published, and then thinking about my relationship to writing and diagramming, collecting publications, and this newer project I'm starting called Text. So it's going to be very quick. We're just going to do some quick breaths because I talk fast and I always have to remind myself to breathe. So we're all just going to take 20 seconds just to breathe, and then we're going to proceed. So let's breath quickly. All righty. Feel free to continue doing this throughout your time. I saw something on Instagram that I thought was completely corny, and then I watched the whole thing, and I was like, "This is not as I thought it was." But it was someone talking about the importance of dedication, and devotion, and being very clear about what you're doing something and announcing, articulating that to ensure that the thing that you're about to do isn't something that's a chore, but it's something that you've like invested in. This is what you're here for. And so today there are a couple of applications I want to offer. First is to me, but more so the 7-year-old, 8-year-old version of myself. And then to my big brother, Jabbar, he was my first friend. And he was like my protector for quite some time. I thank him a lot because in a lot of ways he was kind of like, yeah, I know my younger sister's weird and I need to protect her. And he was always the sort of boundary between me and bullies. I think in a lot of ways his protection allowed me to run to the person I needed versus the person that other folks want to be. I
Thank
also want
you.
to make a dedication
And
to particular element here of my family tree. I've been doing a lot of genealogy work with the goal of understanding who is in my family. I was able to get all the way back to Scotland in the 1400s, but can't find the name of this woman, fourth great grandmother. So in a lot of ways, it's dedicated to publishing in my practice with an interest thinking about the unknown and unproven and thinking about publishing as a speculative practice. Still don't name. We're hoping we find out in the summer. My parents first, my mom and my dad. I think, of course, parents are great. I think in particular, why I'm most interested in this dedication is that my parents very distinctive, very clear, very intentional decision to East Palo Alto, California, before the city became a city. So they literally moved into it, something becoming itself. They themselves were Islam and becoming themselves. Just got married and we're becoming a unit. And so I really appreciate the fact that my parents sort of brought us into this environment of experimentation and sort of thinking about what does it mean not to be finished, but to always be in the process of becoming. The city of East Palo Alto is a place that has a long history and sort of radical education and publishing. We have the only Black-run K through 14 school system in the nation for over a decade. And this is a spread from Ebony magazine. But as I've learned more recently, we also had publishing companies in our neighborhood. So there was something called Black Liberation Publishers, which I'm still trying to source a lot of information around. There's also another group, the Moms for Equal Opportunity, also had a bookstore and published in print. There were a series of bookstores, particularly the Nairobi Community Bookstore. And also more recently, I found out through another Instagram page about our city, we had another newspaper called the East Palo Alto Progress. And so I carry a lot of sort of interest and investment in carrying on Black traditions of publishing. All right, a couple of notes on form. I always do this because I think it's important to talk about sort of the cadence of what I'm about to do. I just love things, but also thinking about artist talks as a form of publishing, as a form of sharing things into the world. And so I take my slides seriously for that reason and think about as part of the performance, part of the practice, part of the art itself. So the first thing I want to offer is that I don't really know anything. I'm just here. I think Clarice Lispector often Agua Viva, where she writes, I want to write you like someone learning. And I like to offer that I want to speak to all of you like someone learning. I also want to bring in Fred Moten and Gladman from this text, One Long Black Sentence from 2020. Renee Gladman is speaking, is creating work, has created. Fred Moten is sort of writing, speaking, drawing, speculating alongside her. And the two parts that sort of strike me, which is sentence comes in the form of an open table, and the other is that a relinquishing of one's shape, sort of associated with this notion of being free, of being in the world. And so part of my time today is to sort of present an open tangle of ideas, but also to allow myself to have myself reshaped in this process. I also want to offer around diacritics and diacritic sort of engagement. I think a lot about, again, slide decks for publishing themselves. I often read them, and sort of the lens through which I revisit them as a publishing context is through the context of diacritic. There is an interview of Deanne where in this interview, she's asked about her relation to this recent text, responds that she believes that poetry is pressure on the page, on space, on time, and that this is a critical text, that she is coming back to herself to override, emphasize what wasn't there, needs to be there. And so I've been thinking about this presentation as a diacritical conversation with talks I've given around publishing. I'm really interested in trying to hone in or clarify what I've been saying. And with that in mind, I was thinking about like literally what are criticals that could be used in thinking about this, and went to Audubey's sort of cryptography to think about using his letters as diacritical marks associated with my name. And so throughout the presentation, you may see a few of these symbols, which are sort of like notes to myself of places where I feel like things are very clear, places where things like my middle name are obscure, and then other places where I feel like I'm almost there and need a little bit of support. And part of the note-taking and process, this was literally going through slides and answering these past slides with mind. Because we're talking about publishing, I have a colophone for a slide deck. Maybe it's extra, but I think it's important. This is a colophone. I think about colophones a lot. I have a colophone for my website that talks about my grandma passed in 2023, this outfit that she's wearing as being the inspiration for the literal color scheme on the website. And so thinking about colophones as sort of a relationship to citation and how we think about citation as a of deep lineage storytelling, importance of thinking about as we're writing, who are we thinking about as co-authors, collaborators in that process. Mrs. Pauline Gumbs is a large inspiration to me in that way. She talks about the importance of writing and publishing beyond individual scholarly authority. She talks about ancestrally co-written texts, and I think these are all just good reminders. We have a platypus because the platypus is the spirit animal of citational practice and interdisciplinary practice. It is an animal that has many different parts and functions from all over the place and is not very embarrassed about it. And so I think in thinking about our practices in citation with that, thinking about the ways that we're pulling from many different disciplines and ways of being and practices and people, our mom to Fred Moten to whoever, to sort of formulate our way of being in the world with a publishing practice. Long note about mixed metaphors. No one, this is just me being hyped about mixed metaphors. I was writing something and someone was like, you're not supposed to use mixed metaphors. And then I got very annoyed because I was like, how could I not use mixed metaphors? So throughout this presentation, you'll see me referring to publishing through a range of metaphors, a range of analogies. And part of that has to do with this notion, for me at least, that mixed metaphors are sort of the confession that we are trying to always catch up with reality through language. And metaphors give us a more capacious sort of compositional field to articulate in our publishing practice, in our practice, what we're feeling, what we're experiencing. Righty. So let's get into some books. Let's get into some publications. I start this genealogy in a very specific way by first the technology that I've used in the practice of making publications. I'm a child of the 80s. I was who was sent to the office frequently when I finished my work too early to go make copies on the mimeograph machine. And that was a very exciting experience for me. And first seeing printing sort of function, seeing sort of the ink that rubbed off of my hands, and being reminded of publishing and printing as this very tactile and intimate practice. When my mom was schooling my baby brother in 94, 95, I would go with her to Kinko's and help her Xerox handouts and packets and workbooks for my brother. And I remember the first time I sort of like stood a Xerox machine, I felt the warmth of the machine, and I thought it was this magical machine. You could just like make copies, and then you could just staple things together and make these tiny books. As we sort of into the 2000s, I started playing etching presses, Xerox machines, graph machines, but I will say the foundation of my publishing practice in the Xerox machine as this very accessible tool that I first encountered as a very young person, associated with sort of like heat and body intimacy and the idea that anyone could make a publication. So as was stated in the introduction, I got my start with publishing early. As I noted, I was really excited about the idea that one could publish books and that other people would read them. And so this is sort of the trajectory from 1991 to 1993. I'm a person of excess. I was very hyped. The best story in this whole collection is this is a sci-fi story about warring planets that have to learn how to share so they arms so they can give resources to other planets. And so it is my favorite story. I should return to it. As you sort of move, there's a gap in time where I'm in school, other stuff is happening. In 2019, I returned to publishing in a more formal way. I was invited by Printed Matter to do a show. And then after that, they were like, do you want to make a book? And I was like, who doesn't want to make a book with Printed Matter? Yes, of course, I would like to make a book. So this is the book that I'll be talking a little bit more about later, but also in 2019 published this book called An Alphabetical Accumulation of Approximate Observations, and then a digital publication, and then these other two publications published in Europe as part of exhibitions. Another thing that I'll note in terms of like the genealogy of my practice is that I have an imprint currently. It's called Scratch This Full, and it's an imprint of a educational project I've called Little Octopus School. And the way that I imagine Scratch This Full, around excess. I think a lot about neurodivergence and leaky sensory gating and too many ideas. And you have a show and you have all these things you say you want to do, but they don't necessarily fit into the form of an exhibition. They don't necessarily fit into the form of a catalog or an artist book, but there's just stuff that you just get out. And so the idea of a scratch this is that when the this is full, when you're in Photoshop, you can do anything else, you're sort of suspended. And so the idea of scratch this full sort of a place for myself and others to sort of like release and sort of share the things that have been percolating that find a home elsewhere. So in 24, I did something with Emerson College of a show, which was a series of ephemera and other like notes that I had taken to the show that didn't really have a place. Similarly, in 2024 with Cat, and then in 2024, going to 2025, I made this sort of like kit teach people how to make books using chant and determiners. And for the rest of 2025, we're on two readers, one about Penelope the platypus, which was a platypus who escaped the zoo in the 50s because they kept trying to get her to be pregnant by sea. And so she escaped and sort of this like lore around her. And the other one is about Eldridge Cleaver and his codpiece pants, which is something you should just Google, just Cleaver codpiece pants. The other thing that I'll note here in terms of like the genealogy of my publishing practice is thinking about my deaf doula work. Over the past couple of years, just people have just been dying. I think my immediate response to that was like, well, how do I save things? How do I organize things? And so I became the go-to person for making obituaries for my family. And in that process, got really interested in thinking about my relationship to publishing and relationship to death. And I was cleaning out my grandmother's house earlier this year, finding this whole treasure trove of obituaries and sort of thinking about the aesthetics of designing Black obituaries, relationships with churches and funeral was part of that as well. So as I'm still finishing my schooling, I'm very interested that deaf doula practice being in sort of like publication archiving for families who have passed, who want in some way to be able to rate them through the form of publication. Mentioning necropolitics because as a person who's a descendant of slave people, as a person who has had many family members pass in ways that not have been the situation, I'm really interested in the idea and reality of the ways in which and how we die, who gets to die, who to kill, is sort of reflected by the power dynamics exist, and sort of thinking about publishing these obituaries as an opportunity to not like invert those dynamics, but to at least allow peace and an archiving of people who may traditionally not be archived, may traditionally not be acknowledged in other historical context. So I want to notes and thinking about these publications and thinking about how I'm relating to it with regards to compression and quantum entanglement. There was a point a couple of ago where I don't know why I just obsessed with quantum mechanics. Everything that I could ever make sense of had to come through that lens. I was like, oh, this is blah, blah, blah. And it was enough sure to some people because they're like, but it's not. For me, in my brain, it makes so much sense to sort of think about publication, a language and sort of system of physics, and thinking about installations as another sort of physics of publication. On March 15th, I gave this talk at Swiss Institute on speculative diagramming, where I was talking about the idea of a diagram as sort of this authoritative drawing, and my interest in thinking about speculative diagramming as sort of diagrams or schematics that are open to revision or change over time. And halfway through that presentation, I was diagram is this, diagram is that. And I realized that what I was really talking about was also publishing. And by that, I also think I was just talking about any attempts to organize information into one place and my relationship to those acts, those gestures, those attempts. And so what I'll sort of share next are sort of like literal revisions of these slides with sort of thoughts in mind. So I kept thinking about a diagram of relational technology, and that publishing is relational technology. We publish not because, well, publish because you just want to hear ourselves speak. Publish because in some ways we want to form a connection with someone else. We're writing something, we're sharing something, we're putting something in the world for the purpose of allowing other people to see, connect, relate, and possibly write back to us. And so one of the questions that I asked during the presentation, sort of this question around diagrams and how they're trying to compress information and how difficult that can be in terms of sort of a disciplinary technology. And I thought about my relationship to publishing and writing being very similar. I was recently called a writer, and I actually kind of got upset about it because I had never identified as I've had and continued so many difficulties with writing because of this sort of sense of compression, the sense of truncating, the sense of pulling things together. And so I think about publication as one of these gestures of compression or pulling together, not in a negative way, but a way for me to sort of think about when does publishing become important to me versus when does installation become important to me versus when does giving a talk become important to me. I kept thinking about diagrams and publishing in relation to Emily Dickinson. She was writing these letters to Thomas Higginson, who was the editor at The Atlantic at the time, and he was basically going forth with her because sort of her was more chaotic than he desired. And so she would write these letters, which are these sort of cheeky letters where she's trolling him about sort of her writing style. And so one of the letters reads, "Dear friend, are these more orderly? I thank you for the truth. I had no monarch in my life and cannot rule myself. And when I try to organize, my little force explodes and leaves me bare and charred. I think you called me wayward. Will you help me improve?" And so I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about publication as this attempt to collect, organize this little explosive force of information, explosive force of learning through the process of binding, publishing, and sort of sending it out into the world. And that sort of conversation got me thinking about quantum entanglement and thinking about the idea of binding a book together as sort of a leash or a tether, and thinking about something related to quantum entanglement, that when we decide to publish something, we're pulling all these ideas and pages together, we're binding them, saying this is a whole. This is considered to be part of itself. They're connected at times. And so quantum entanglement sort of offers this interesting language for me that two particles that were in relation at some always be related. And so I'm interested in the idea of a publication as being part of this sort of metaphor or analogy of quantum entanglement, but also what can publish when we sort of think about a book that can be assembled and reorganized in relation to other texts and relation to other things that have been created. Part of this sort of conversation around quantum, again, has a lot to do with my relationship to notions of wholeness. Part of what I did when I gave this key for the Center for Book Art and Matter Fair back in 2022 was actually be like, what is a book? And a lot of the conversation was book is something that is a whole. It presents itself as a whole. It is something that meant to be final and complete in some sort of way. You'll see in a moment, this is something I've grappled with a lot because most of the publications made have been revised publicly publications or something else that has never been finished, but is continuously on. And so I think about binding in this sort of process of holding things together, and my interest in sort of thinking about ways of exploring the notion of compression and thinking about institution as this practice that isn't necessarily the opposite of publishing, but offers a sort of decompression of the process of a book being bound. And maybe is a process of unbinding a book or exploding a book into space. And so a book is a temporary gathering or a bond. A book is not quantum entanglement. We can take a book apart, we can take a publication apart and spatialize that publication through other forms. I'm not gonna have time for this. I would love to, we're not gonna do it. I just talk a little bit about this notion of floating things into space, because that before I actually made books in this more formal way, I was making books in space. So this is a show in 2017 that Steph also in at CA Philadelphia called Speech Act. And I'm mentioning this because the impetus for the organization work of this show was to sort of think about what it might mean to walk through an entire book, but with your entire body. So reading with one's eyes, what might it feel to read with one's body? A lot of the way that I started making installations was like trying to make one gigantic book that people could literally travel through with their entire bodies. And I'll just click through a few other examples of things. We're not going to have time to slow down and talk about them, but just sort of as a reminder of like these attempts. And I'm all of these because part of what I want to say is that as I was thinking about the presentation, I'm a person who makes publications. I'm not a person who thinks about themselves as a publisher or as a writer, as a person or a person who is a book person. I'm just like this. I just do a book when I need to do a book. I was asking myself, at what point in my practice does a publication make sense? Does an installation make sense? Does a talk make sense? And I realized that whenever I'm feeling very mortal, I make books, I publications. Whenever I'm feeling the sense like something needs to be left behind, something is missing, or I feel to sort of collect, organize, and sort of collate, that's when I make publications. However, when I feel a bit trapped or I feel restricted or I feel overly compressed, this is where I want to sort of open my chest and actually create these installations. I deliver talks when I'm feeling speculative and improvisational and uneasy, and I teach almost exclusively around. That is because I never want to go too confident. So whenever I think like, oh, I figured it out, teaching becomes important to me, which is why I teach all the time. I want to keep it humble. But I think about sort of publication as sort of register of my practice, not as a fullness of my practice, register that I sort of use or engage with as a response to a particular inferiority, but also as a way for me to process something. I process through publications in a very particular way that I don't do with sprawling installations. So let's look at one of these things. I want to offer through this sort of case study of this text, No New Theory, that I'm thinking about publishing in the language of Ashton Crowley within the context of something he talks about as sustaining undoneness or tearing with concepts. In this 2017 text, Black Pentecostal Breath, he writes, Black Pentecostal aesthetics are about being and sustaining undoneness. As undone, these aesthetic practices are about the refusal of being centered, about dispersing with the spatio-temporal geometric logics of Western civil society, a search, a performance of otherwise directionality. Black Pentecostal Breath is not about resolve, openness to worlds, to experiences, to ideas. Black Pentecostal Breath does not so much as arrive at conclusions as it with concepts. And so through this next example, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of publishing being about undoing yourself versus finishing up or closing something off. So we're going to talk about this book. So in 2018, actually, I published a book called No New Theories. I was super hyped about it. I had worked with this designer who did and we had done special effects because in my mind, a book needs special effects and like mid 2000s GI, like every cutout, every special, let's just do it all. So the book was published in 2018. I remember going to printer, picking up my copies, and I don't remember opening them immediately. I was like, I'm just gonna have a moment for this. And I take them home and I maybe 2 days pass, and then I open a book and I'm like, oh, this one doesn't like something's off here. So it's probably just this copy. And I keep flipping. And it's not just that copy. All the copies have some misprints. And I don't know what happened. I don't know whose fault it was, but I remember Tech Keith, who I was working with at Print and Matter, being like, we got to burn the books, pull them off the shelf, call every purchase a book, make sure they don't the book because it's wrong. I literally had this like very emotional summer because I had been spending all this time giving these lectures about contingency and the importance of public learning. When it happened to me, it wasn't cute, it wasn't fun, it was terrifying. This idea that I put something out into the world that I thought was complete, that I thought bound, that I thought was compressed in a way that and it was perfect, and it wasn't. And so we took some time off, and then top of 2019, we heard back printers. I think they said, "Oh, I think we made a mistake," and so we're able to republish the book, which is with the 2019 publication, No New Theories. My first impulse was like, we're going to check every single thing to make sure every single thing is correct, which is why you see these spreads of giant pages, which is why you see these notebooks of like drafting to make sure that everything came together. We at first attempted, we were like, just cut out pages of the old book and do X, Y, and Z. That didn't work. We were like, we're going to republish it. And so I remember being particularly obsessive about this editing process. I was like, this is the time where we're not going to mess it up. But then there was this other moment where I was, well, if I'm outside, very outside, talking about learning and talking about and thinking about this idea of the unfinished or being undone, what does it mean that I'm hiding the fact that something else preceded this? What sort of gestures can I make in the publication of this text that actually allude to the fact that something came before this? And so what ended up happening with this publication, I'll just flip through a couple of images, is that in the center of the text, there's an interview. And in that interview was re-edited and typeset, but the interviewee and I went to this text and started to annotate it. So she took the interview and took it on a road trip and wrote some notes, sent them back to me, which I include as footnotes. And I went through and annotated the interview again. And I said that there are still errors in this book, y'all. There are still errors in this book, and I think that's sort of an important reminder for myself. And so in thinking about publication, the thing that became exciting to me and thinking through the idea of publication being something that's sort of a versus sort of a finished frame, is that I sort of was able to play with the idea of like core text being the most important text and what it might mean to sort of decentralize or to think about other parties or other centers in a given text. That annotations themselves can be the center of this text, that they can be the most important part of the text, not just the things that were planned and intended. Any more images I'll share here. I want to just offer that part of the reason I'm really interested and concerned with talking about this process is that I think honesty in the publishing practice is really important. And when I say honesty, I'm not talking about like citation, which you should do. I'm talking about sort of the actual emotional, psychological, spiritual struggles of publishing something. I was reading Madeline Ginn's reader that was edited by Lucy Ives, and she mentions the scholar Orit Houghton, who talks about the importance of talking through process. And they said descriptions of processes always become sites for further production, new techniques of production. And so I've been thinking about this a lot of like, let's talk about my practice and my process. And I must talk about this to support my own practice and the development of what I'm doing, but also as a way to remind us that most, if not everything that we're doing is iterative, a blur iterative process, and that publishing is presented to us as a final act, ongoing iterative act that we must be returning to. And so I've been thinking about publishing as this ecological practice, this idea of creating an ecosystem of iterative and provisional projects that, in the words of Fred Moten, refuse to cold. That in sort of the tradition of Black scholars like Catherine McKittrick and Mrs. Pauline Gumbs, that were in sort of a certain type of Blackness, that Blackness and Black people and Black existence is something that's going, and I want to be ongoing, perpetuity, and that I must apply the ethics of aliveness to the way that I approach publication. And so part of that language is thinking about practice and relationship to cycles of text. That part of the shift for me in publishing this book was sort of thinking through, in my published book, because I want to get ideas out, would be a thing. That's perfectly fine. Is this sort of a spiritual practice of thinking about life cycles, thinking about life and death? As a person who is trying to be a deaf doula, I've been thinking about death, literally in terms of like the physical corporeal death, but also thinking about my relationship to death and cycles of living in relation to my practice. And so the three images you see here, the first is from my dad's notes when he was converting to Islam in the 1980s. He would come home from pharmacy school, flip over his notes, write a bunch of like photocopy a bunch of stuff, paste it these notes over and over and over. You would see this sort of palimpsest of information build up over time. And then the last image here is 2021. I was trying to write an essay about incompletion, which ironically is still not done. And part of that process was me actually identifying that I could not write an essay about incompletion as I could write a series of notes to a wall that I kept returning. And that was going to be the publication, something that people visited as an embodied experience versus something that I published as an essay in a final format. And so when I'm thinking about revision and life cycles, I always want to offer us as multicellular organisms as the side of revision. That the way that I think about revision in the practice is thinking about traditions of orality, but also about Black traditions of call and response. That call and response is typically someone's making a call, everyone else making a response. And I think that it happens in your publishing practice as eyes, that my former calls on my future or present self respond, that my future self is calling my past self to respond, but that call and response is happening within my publishing practice as a reminder that I must always return to all versions of myself in this publishing, because all versions of myself will keep in what I produce. And I'm thinking a lot about this text from a book, and sorry, the citation is cut off here, which is called The Life Cycles of American Literature, which talks about the progression of archives, which goes from creation, capture, storage, use, disposal. One of the questions that I often think about publishing practice is the question around like, what might it mean to keep a text in a perpetual state of creation, never to be captured? What might it mean to keep a text in draft that I can always return, that I can always sort of emendate, that I can always say, hey, there's something else about a publication, not as a period, a comma. These are some high color of my dad's notes. I'm giving a talk at Brown in 2019. This girl raises her hand and she's like, "Oh, does dad have anything to do with your practice?" And I got annoyed. I remember being annoyed because I was like, "What does my have to do with this?" And she was like, "Go back and it was in that moment that I realized that the way that No New Theories is organized is actually an homage to my father. So much the way that I think about publishing in text is very rooted in being in a very text-centric home of parents' notes of like flyers and handouts and prayer schedules. All this sort of matter in my home became sort of this inflection for me implicitly in the way that I think about text and the way that it shows up in the world. I'll point to Banu Capel, who wrote Schizophrene, beginning of that text, talks about her sort of relationship to her publication, her manuscript. She says, towards the end of this project, I felt the great strength of the page, its ability as a fibrous surface reflects the point of my pen, paper, and then the screen as weirdly reflective, repelling the ink the touch. I threw it in the form of a book, a handwritten final draft, into the garden of my house. And goes on to say she retrieved her notes and then she wrote from those fragments. And so I really like this idea of identifying writers, poets, who are thinking about their process as being sort of collaborative in terms of nature and climate, but also this idea that we put something out in the world, we allow for some sort of active or collaborative process, and then we return to it, but it is never a finished object. It is ecological, metaphorically in terms. Um, I have like maybe 4 minutes. I'm going to wrap up with a couple of around publishing. We're not going to talk about promiscuity and kaleidoscopic, but you should think about reading by Clarice Lispector. I think it's a good about publishing. I do want to point to Pope L, though. Pope L in this 2017 text talks about these two particular projects as being notational. And by notational, I mean that each work was a notation towards some larger sketch, perhaps leading to some even larger up. And so I've been thinking about the ways that mock mock-up notation and diagramming show practice, and that my interest in publishing has often been about being able to see versions, being able to see something at its beginning and seeing something at its end, and then that end becoming a new beginning. And it shows up in my installation practice as well, with an interest in sort of writing being shown not as a final product, almost a series of layers of many different processes, engines sort of overlapping one another. Also come Pope L, he also talks about his work being a dynamic open set that happens over time. And this is a beautiful way to describe one's practice, but it feels like an apt description of a publishing practice that is open and immersive and sort of evolving, that it is a dynamic open set where we're sort of allowing things to happen, but we're also acting on the publishing practice. A few other things that I'll mention, and maybe I'll actually end here. There's a writer named Elvia Wilk who published an essay in 2019 in eFlux called Ask for Before You Bite. It was LARPing culture. And he makes a reference to of like what love is and recognition. She writes, mutual love is often thought of as mutual recognition. I see you for who you are and me back. But recognition is inevitably also a naming, a fixed pinning down. In order to recognize, you have to categorize, and categories are notoriously inflexible. Recognition, if understood as a protection that disallows the evolution of identity, becomes restrictive rather than liberating. However, inadvertently, the recognition required mutual love can easily slip into a form of control. And then a letter, maybe a couple months or a year, I wrote in response to this, I like this notion of love that does not rest on mutual recognition as much as a desire to unknown, unrecognized. Possibly the height of love is not freezing people into a clear image, but it's that person swells beyond the compositional field you have created for them. So I want to end there sort of on this note of about what publishing can be, that oftentimes it doesn't actually have to be a final product, that it can be something that we return to, that many of the other speakers in the workshop during this week will get into the like gritty of different types of publishing. But I think in a sort of a formal spiritual way, I kind of want to offer publishing as a place to really learn about yourself. And I think there's one slide that I have here where I actually write, that I think that publishing is my teacher. Publishing has become a teacher for me in terms of being able to relate to contingency and change over time. It has helped me think about perfectionism. It has helped me think about what public evolution means in terms of how you present yourself, how others are receiving you, but it's consistently sort of this reminder of the importance of uncertainty being an important motivating factor, at least in my creative practice. And I'm going to be very end right now because I don't want to be that person. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to this first talk. And I'm excited for questions or comments or complaints or thoughts, whatever's coming up.
Thank you so much, Kameelah. That was incredible. So much. I was like screenshotting everything so I can go back and like have such a have more experience. This is like so much beautiful material. So the Jessica and Johnny are sort of compiling some questions in the chat to share. Yeah, I'm looking in the chat. Lots of thanks, lots of appreciation, lots of inspiration. Love the idea of publishing as like a space of opening, and also a space of like self-recognition. And shout out to another from another like hand in the air kid in the classroom with a lot to say. So again, just really appreciation for everything you shared. So yeah, so one of the first question that we have is from Dan. He says, I'm super interested in how the typography and design language of this presentation itself came about. Is this something you can speak on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have this thing where I think about letters as like characters, and having their own personality, interiority. And so whenever I'm making something, it's not good enough for me to like go and find a font and then print it or put it on the screen. That I need to find the A that has the right personality or interiority, like hold itself in a sentence a word. And so part of it I was going to share at the end is called Text Forager, which came conversation with my gallerist because how do I explain what you do? And he's like, you hunt for text. And I was like, yeah, I think actually that's what I'm doing. I spend a lot of time either at my computer scrolling like, oh, this is like the perfect like letter F. This is like the perfect like parentheses. I'm taking photos of like handwriting throughout the day as I'm walking. But there's a real interest for me in thinking about vernacular typeface and vernacular as part of the content form of writing that for me it isn't enough just to like have the content, but I want in some way form of the letters to be responsive to the content and the concepts I'm trying to convey. I'm also a kid like the 80s and 90s, early computers, and grew up in Silicon Valley and did coding. And a lot of my early sort of interface with typeface was sort of playing with all of the system fonts on Apple computers and then learning how to play with system fonts, either in terms of changing weights or other things, to create something more experimental. So I think there's just for me a sense of intimacy with the materiality of language, where a letter doing more than conveying information has sort of an affect, and I want to pick the right letter for that affect.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I have a question from Stephanie. Can you talk a little bit about your research process? How do you organize and sort of keep track of all this prolific material?
Yeah, so I got this question last night when I was giving a talk at Carnegie Mellon, and I was like, oh, I really wish I could give you like I use Arena or I do this. A lot of ways it is a lot less sexy and organized. So my research is like in a lot of ways rooted in my neurodivergence is obsession based. So something sort of like latch in a way where I can't sort of kick it. So for me, it's not so much like I'm like, oh, I need to research X, Y, Z. It may be that I see something or hear something, and then I keep returning to it either because I keep seeing things that are referencing it, or I actively and unconsciously sort of pursuing. And through that sort of like a month will go by and I will go back through my phone, go back through a document and say, oh, you've been obsessed with compression. You've been obsessed with compression for 6 now. Like that is your mode of research. And so in a lot of ways, I like to allow for my poor sensory to sort of lead me versus me leading what I research, because I do believe that there's some difficulty in poor sensory gaining, but some in being able to collect and put in a lot and then being able to build those relationships. I think the other way that I've learned a lot about myself and my learning is that I thought that I was a note taker, and I'm not. I process verbally almost exclusively, and that writing is very secondary and tertiary for me. And so part of my practice has been spending time actually trying to actually just sending myself voice notes, and then those voice notes I will then transcribe them and then sit with those. And then I'll diagram between those transcripts. So I may like wake up, dream, and then record it to my phone, get it transcribed, and then using that transcription, start mapping it to other things and seeing what comes. I also work with like different sort of types of, so working with acetate a lot has been helpful when I do diagramming because I can then layer diagrams versus using a more opaque paper that doesn't allow for layering. I think that sort of allows for me to build layers, core samples of information, allows for me to build sort of diagrams. This is my process. And I forget stuff, but I actually enjoy forgetting things because I think that things come back when they need to. So like in a talk, like there are references that I'll make that I won't make again, but there are also references not included in the slides that are important for me to bring up that I happen to remember in this moment. So I like part of it to be improvisational, but sort of verbalizing and diagramming is my main method.
Great, thank you. A question from Howard. How do you reconcile the in real life and archive?
How do I reconcile in real life and archive? Can you clarify this a little bit?
Yeah,
What is
Howard,
the
if you want to clarify a little bit what you mean by that. Howard's still here. Maybe while he's writing out, while Howard's writing out, oh, there, presentations and spaces and the broader archive. That was the clarification. I guess the
Okay, I think what I'm understanding is like how do you deal with like existing and then how that what gets into archive, maybe. Okay, gotcha. Comes to installation and having I have a really terrible process that I'm sure curators hate, which is I'll be like, we're having a show. I don't know where anything is going. I'm just gonna bring a bunch of stuff, ship a bunch of stuff, and then we'll just hang out for weeks and we'll figure it out. Part of that is like my own sort of woo-woo process of like wanting to feel the energy of the space before making decisions on where things go. A lot of it is also a desire to be improvisational and to study how people move in the space. So there's some sort of choreography between the eye and the space and how people's bodies are moving. But in a lot of ways, when I'm making decisions around install work that I consider to be archival or making an installation that then feels archival, I am in trouble sort of the notions of like an archive being fixed taxonomy or grid. It is indexical, but at the same time allows for gaps and holes. One of the things that I didn't get to talk about with L in whole theory, there's this one very particular line, I think it's like 8.1, where he says, there's a hole beneath the sentence. And I think that's sort of a guiding that I think about my relationship to archiving installation. There are a series of holes that are intentional and unintentional throughout the piece to allow for what L says, which is for other people to fill in the holes with their experience. So I think that is sort of my approach to archiving when it comes to installations, but also email me if I did not answer your question at all. More than happy to clarify.
Okay, I'm gonna pose one last question for folks whose question I didn't get to. Apologies. We will do our best to sort of circulate them in this conversation and others. The last question I have is thank you for showing the mistakes. Can you speak to a particular mistake, or maybe just speak in general to a mistake being a place of generation and not something that we should think of as holding us back?
Yeah, so the Project No New Theories, as hyperbolic as it may sound, was a moment of like deep spiritual transition and development for me, because part of the mistake, there were mistakes. The first mistake was in sort of how I entered the publishing project, right? I entered it as like putting out this monument of something that would not be changed, that will exist as part of my practice for this long time, as sort of this testament to what I could do in publishing. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was in thinking through what it meant to actually have to talk about the publication in public if and there was a mistake, right? So I take a bit of time to actually process how do I talk about this? And so I think when it comes to mistakes being generative, I think this is sort of a discussion, like to what extent do you have the threshold to think about those things as generative, but I also think there's a considerable way to approach it. So me, because the error was in the printing of the interview, my immediate response was to think about how do I actually articulate that something came before this. So like we have histories of Palo, we have histories of annotations, histories of marginalia and real text. And so all of those become important ways for me to say like what we're doing is actually not in the sense that historically people have always added onto text through marginalia. And so I think part of this is identifying, yeah, what is the mistake or what is the error you think you've made or you have made? And then is there a historical precedent that you can riff off of as a way to develop this into an actual conceptual project? I never for people to be like, and No New Theories is a conceptual project about mistakes. That's just what happened. And I'm that I actually leaned into it versus recoiling, because I think that in leaning into it, it allowed for me to actually think about how redaction or revision annotation shows up everywhere in practice and ways that I could use it also as a teaching tool to think about revision with students as well.
That is amazing. Timing is amazing and perfect. Thank you so, so much, Kameelah. This was so rich. I got so much. I know we all got so much. And yeah, thank you all.